This is Vanessa Gorman. Today we're going to talk about adjectives and pronouns. And just as with the other parts of speech, I want to talk to you about them in English first before we get into the Greek morphology of the different forms. Adjectives are words that modify nouns. And we've already seen a very common adjective in the form of the article. Technically speaking, the article is a type of adjective. We see adjectives in many different ways in Greek, and we see them categorized in different ways. Now, I'm going to introduce you to some terms right up front so that when I use them later, they will be familiar to you. One is the word attributive. So an attribute is something that modifies. So attributive function, or sometimes called the attributive position, is when the adjective is being used to describe the noun very directly. And so the guilty nourarchs, the hostile Carians, they are typically hung on the nouns they modify and labeled as ATR, attributes, in dependency syntax. Adjectives can also be used substantively, right, as a substance, that is, as a noun, in place of a noun. And so we do this in English as well, saying the guilty fled, the hostiles attacked the city. There's this sense of a word that is left out or elided, right? The guilty men, people, something. But this is something that many languages do, Greek and English among them. We don't need to have the stated noun there necessarily, and so adjectives can become substantized, act in place of nouns, and do whatever a noun might do in the sentence. So there are types of adjectives that people will discuss. For example, qualitative. This is just sort of your generic modifier, handsome, ugly, Persian. There are possessive adjectives that we're going to get to in pieces. My, your, his, her, right? These are technically speaking not genitives. They are adjectives that are in the possessive. Her ship, its foot, their mouth. There are also what are called relative and interrogative possessives. Relative meaning who or what or which or whatever. The ones that can be used as questions, interrogative meaning questions, who are you? Or relative, he is the man who sailed to the Black Sea. So that kind of who will introduce a relative clause that we're going to be dealing with much later. Numerals are technically speaking adjectives. 1, 2, 3, 4th, 20th, so both cardinals and ordinals we'll be talking about. And there are a number of what are called indefinite adjectives. We talked about how the Greek doesn't have a word for a or an, but it does have a word for some or any or every or each or any. And also, more specifically, the things that we called demonstrative adjectives. That is, this man, that woman, those people. All right. The demonstratives, essentially, you're demonstrating, you're pointing at someone, you're emphasizing someone. Another characteristic of adjectives is that they have what's called degree. The normal adjective form is usually called the positive or just normal, and that's what you're used to seeing: red, handsome, tall. And most adjectives are positive, and if it's not labeled otherwise, it's positive, because sometimes in our analyzers, our morphological analyzers, it doesn't put a degree in there. That means it's just positive. Now, we also have what's called the comparative, which is usually expressed with either the ER ending or with the word more. Redder, taller, larger, more handsome, more beautiful, more ugly, right? This is the comparative. And you can't have a meaningful comparative without something to which you compare it. So remember, we already talked about genitive of comparison. Redder than someone, taller than someone is going to be expressed in the genitive, or taller by 3 inches, dative of degree difference. So these are things we've already mentioned that we're going to deal with more as we deal with comparatives. And then finally, you have what's called the superlative, which is usually the EST or the most or as much as possible. You can also translate it sometimes. Reddest, most handsome, tallest, right? Fastest. So these are the degrees of adjectives. The positive is the normal form. The comparative and superlative are the ER and the EST form. EST superlative meaning the most of, and that will go with a genitive of the whole or a partitive genitive, right? Most of the men. We're explaining what the most is coming out of. So that will show up with the genitive quite a lot. So which of these words are adjectives and what nouns do they modify? Well, other, hand, great danger, all accounts, deep silence, and their army. These are all adjectives. Likewise, in this passage, large villages, abundant provisions, splendid wild animals. We have adjectives in a series there. Some enclosed parks, some of them. So some is here typically actually an adjective acting like a pronoun. It's acting like a noun substantively. Enclosed parks, others, again substantively, in open spaces. So that brings us to pronouns. What's a pronoun? It's a word that replaces a noun within the sentence. And the word that it replaces is called the antecedent. And if you write papers for me in English, I'm often circling pronouns and saying indefinite antecedent. I don't know which he this word refers to. Pronouns often function adjectivally. So those Spartans is a demonstrative adjective. Those fought really well is a demonstrative pronoun. That went fast, right? So the same words that are adjectives can also act as substantives, as pronouns, in other words, if there's no noun expressed. And again, we have the typical types of pronouns. There's the personal pronoun, which are the words I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they, and their cases, like me, my, us, them. The article often stands in for the third person personal pronoun. So if you just have an article with no noun, it can mean he or they or she. There are possessive pronouns, mine, yours, his, hers, its, theirs. That book is mine. That book is hers. Reflexive pronouns are used when the object is the same as the subject. This is a word that's often misused. This is the self version in English. Myself, herself. People use it in a kind of hyper correction to sound humble and when they shouldn't. Basically, it should only be used if it's referring to something that is also the subject of the sentence. I did it myself is correct use. She did it for myself is not correct use because she is the subject and it's myself is not the same entity. Interrogative pronouns are the ones that ask questions. We're all familiar with those. We'll get to them a bit later. And then, as I said, demonstratives can function either as adjectives or pronouns. Indefinite pronouns, the same way. Indefinite adjectives function just like indefinite pronouns. So it's a question of whether it's modifying something or not. And they don't need articles, definites and indefinites, to make them substantive. They can just do it on their own. So which of the following words are pronouns? Okay, this is a demonstrative. To visit him is a personal pronoun. Seized him, imprisoned him, ordered him. Themselves, so it's referring back to Alcibiades and Mantitheus, and so that's a reflexive. And their escape is a possessive. So we've gone through all of those. So now you have, I hope, a good grip on what are adjectives and what are pronouns. And the fact that these two cases, or these two parts of speech, overlap each other quite a bit in Greek, as we'll see when we look at the Greek forms themselves.